Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Welcome to this event to discuss the one of the latest in a series of reports that I think are incredibly useful for all of us as students, as academics, practitioners from RAND. Today, we're going to be discussing pathways to a durable Israeli-Palestinian peace. I think, by virtue of the title, couldn't think of a more timely topic, of course, to discuss. I also, I introduce myself. My name is Jonathan Lincoln. I'm the director of the Center for Jewish Civilization. I'm also incredibly grateful to the Security Studies program and also the Department of Government, who have co-sponsored this and helped us arrange this event. I'll just introduce our discussants, I think, for the evening, and also the authors, at least some of the authors of the report. And then we'll have a little bit of a discussion. We'll get to hear from them, and then open it up to questions and answers from the audience. I'm incredibly grateful to all of the authors, but we're incredibly lucky to have with us today Ambassador Charles Rees. Ambassador Rees is, of course, an adjunct senior fellow at RAND. His research focuses on the economics of development, trade, transatlantic, and Middle Eastern affairs. And previously, Ambassador Rees was Vice President International at RAND. And he's led projects on post-war reconstruction of Ukraine, economic and political effects of Brexit, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and national security decision-making, among others. We're also joined by Shelley Culbertson. Shelley Culbertson is a senior policy researcher at RAND, professor of policy analysis at the RAND School of Public Policy. Shelley's research focuses on disaster, post-conflict recovery, immigration, mass migration policy, refugees, global education, and international development. She's also the author of The Fires of Spring, a post-Arab Spring journey through the turbulent New Middle East by St. Martin's Press. She's also worked on and led research on two other, I think, incredibly relevant reports that just came out from RAND recently. The first was From Camps to Communities, a plan for post-conflict shelter in Gaza, as well as a spatial vision for Palestine, which really builds on RAND's historic and landmark research and work on envisioning a future Palestinian state in its ARC project. And this report looks at a series of projects that can begin now in order to support that goal. We're also joined by Daniel Eagle. Daniel is an economist at RAND. He's the director of RAND's Initiative for Economics and Security, and RAND's Department of State portfolio manager, and a professor of policy analysis at the RAND School of Public Policy. Daniel's research focuses on the intersection of economics and national security and DDR, as I just recently learned, particularly as it applies to U.S. overseas activities. And he earned his PhD in economics from the University of California at Berkeley. So thank you really to this incredibly distinguished panel. And thank you for the report. If I may, just in my own, offer some quick reactions, maybe just to the report, and in again trying to just reiterate how useful I think it is, especially in an academic context, just given its structure, its focus on case studies, and of course its timeliness, not just looking at the past, but very much with a forward look as to what we can do. So before I ask Ambassador Rees to start, maybe I'll just sort of offer a few thoughts. I mean, in terms of the structure, at least, I think it's interesting, and there's something unique really about this particular report, in that it starts with this very large problem statement, of course, given the unprecedented nature of the October 7th attacks and the subsequent war. Also, I think in terms of this leadership deficit that was incredibly prominent, at least at the beginning of the report. Then we look at the case studies, and then only then do we really look at proposals for how to change the situation. I think second, one thing that struck me and I think would be really interesting for our audience to understand is this recognition of a changed U.S. role, whether that's a result of the failed peace process, the failed Oslo Accords, the particular nature of this conflict since October 7th, or maybe a combination. And then I think third, the prescriptions was, of course, Brand known for its prescriptions, but also looking at it specifically given this sort of changed U.S. role, we're looking at recommendations specifically for the Arab states, Europe, the United Kingdom, even Russia, China, and Iran. And when you put that together, I think that gives this report somewhat of a unique approach. So maybe, Ambassador, if I could start with you, and you could sort of talk us through the report, the impetus behind this report, how you chose to approach a report on an issue that is really quite well covered in general. Ambassador,
well, thank you very much, Jonathan, and thanks to all of you for coming. And I hope we'll have a good discussion of this is a very difficult topic and very timely, as you mentioned, and we're all grappling with it. I think on the origin story, I think it's important. First of all, this is, while we do have a printed copy or two, but this is a native digital document. And you can just go to rand.org and type in pathways in the search bar. You don't have to have the whole title. And this is the first thing that comes up. I checked it, so I can say that. And it's all completely free in PDF form. And some of the other studies that we'll mention during the course of this evening are also similarly available. We have done work for over a decade on the public policy challenges of creating a successful Palestinian state, if that's the way it goes, and finding a more durable peace in the region, which is so important to U.S. interests as well as the world at large. And when the horrific war broke out on October 7th, our trustees were meeting in November, and they said RAND must be engaged in analysis of what comes next. What's the post-war? What's the ongoing story in light of all the things that we've done? And they made an extraordinary allotment of funding from our endowment. We have no sponsors, no donors for this project. It comes out of the RAND endowment and out of the conviction that RAND should have something to say about this. And I was asked to lead it. And the first thing I did was call Daniel, and then we called Shelley, and we put together a good team to work on it. Let me just say a little bit more about the structure. You're right, Jonathan. We tried to think this thing through in a logical fashion, and the structure is no accident. We start with a problem statement of, what is it that we consider to be a durable peace? Then we have a chapter on the history of the Arab-Palestinian or the Arab-Israeli conflict from 48 forward, in a very compressed form, of course, looking to what are the unique characteristics of this dispute that's made it so hard to resolve in 75 years. And we highlight, there are many, of course, we highlight three: lack of leadership, on both sides committed to peaceful coexistence with the neighboring. Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Three unique characteristics or particular characteristics of this conflict. A lack of leadership committed to a peaceful coexistence that you could build upon. Incompatible territorial aspirations of both sides, and a third, international meddling. Another way to put that is spoilers, who actually had interests in keeping the conflict going for other geopolitical or regional interests. We then did this case study chapter. So we said, okay, it's sui generis, Israel-Palestine, Israeli-Palestinian, but there are other conflicts, Northern Ireland, Kosovo, East Timor, Nagorno-Karabakh, that have characteristics that are not wildly dissimilar. What happened there? What kinds of implications could be drawn from those cases that might have a bearing in how you might tackle this one? And mindful of the great history and many great minds and great diplomats that have tried to take things forward. And we included that in terms of resolved cases, Camp David between Anwar Sadat's historic trip to Jerusalem and the Israeli Egyptian peace treaty. So having done all of that, the guts of the pathways is a chapter that has 5 parts. And we were very deliberate about how we set up the 5 parts. We started with security because there is no path to a durable peace, in our view, that doesn't start with security for Israelis and security for Palestinians. And so we, as others have, build a security vision based on interim commitment of a multinational security force. This would be a security force with engagement from senior Americans, Europeans, and Arab neighbors, drawing on help from Palestinians, but it's not handing over Gaza to the Palestinian Authority supplement. This would be very similar to what we did in the Balkans, where we had a multinational coalition authority that had political responsibility, a senior general, and serious, capable forces. Those forces would be able to deal with Hamas, and its other pals, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, cannot be allowed to continue to operate if you expect to get to a durable peace. But there are many other aspects to providing security. You need security for Israeli neighborhoods that are near the Gaza Strip. You need to have a way to transition this to a longer term horizon. So second is governance. So we have a vision of governance that, again, would give that horizon for Palestinians, that they understand that they're not a ward of the international community forever. You start with local governance, you build a pull together a technocratic government to do civilian administration under this multinational coalition authority, and you transition towards constitution writing, ultimately elections. But that's not enough either. You also need an effective strategy for economic development, both of the Gaza and the West Bank, in line towards building the capacity to have a peaceful, coexisting Palestinian state at some point in the future. And we lay that out. Daniel and I are very strong on the financial sector, but you need to rebuild a lot of the damage, and you need to have a concept for how this makes the people that are living in Gaza better off. And we also talked about reconstruction and rebuilding services like education and health. And importantly, and here this is Shelley's particular sector of interest, how we would transition the temporary camps to longer term peaceful communities, avoiding the risk that you see in refugee camps that become centers for violence and anti-state behavior in the future. So those are the main elements. And then, and only then, do we have our international section where we talk about the roles of the other players in supporting this transition. And importantly, as Jonathan pointed out, we see the United States as not the sole mediator here. We see the United States as an enabler, a process coordinator, and willing and anxious to share what responsibility with other parties like Europeans and Arabs, but not abandoning the field either. We do recommend that the Chinese, if they're willing to accept the framework, also be invited to be significant players. We would consider the Russians and the Iranians to be spoilers and would try to keep them out. So that's the overall thing. And then there's a final chapter, which if you only read one thing, is the thing to read, which summarizes all of this and makes the leadership point. We do feel that in order to get to this future and be able to work on this future, you need security and you need leadership. You need leadership in the Palestinian communities, and you need leadership in Israel that is willing to envisage a peaceful, coexistent relationship with the neighbors and work over the long term to have that happen. So one final word, we found that the work that Shelley and her colleagues are doing on Gaza reconstruction, managing the populations and so forth was so important and impactful that we spun it off into its own paper called From Camps to Communities, which was published 2 weeks ago, right, on the 7th of April. And we benefited from a lot of insights and engagement from urban planners to make that as meaningful as it is. And then finally, Daniel can talk to this. We think as I mentioned at the top of the security thing, question what happens to these Hamas cadres? How do they transition in this durable peace environment? And that really is this question of DDR, sometimes called disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, maybe with a third D of de-radicalization. And Daniel is leading another follow-on effort to do a deep dive into DDR and how you would do DDR in Gaza. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Maybe we can ask Shelley to elaborate a little bit on the work on that bridge to the second report, Camps to Communities, and maybe as you give us your answer, maybe we can also think a little bit about the role of Arab states in particular. There's obviously a huge role in terms of financing. But also when it comes to, a potential participation on the ground, multinational force, et cetera. But of course, there is a proposal on the table. And maybe just thinking about the Arab proposal that was launched at the end of March in Cairo, and what the impact, what do you think of it, first of all, and what its impact might be or has been, if any, on the conversation on reconstruction?
Sure, thank you, Jonathan. Hi, everybody. So as Charlie gave the big picture overview, I'll zoom in on one piece that we did, and as Charlie mentioned, we had a lot, so we turned that into a separate paper. And the question we were looking at with this is that there's been so much destruction in Gaza. You look at the picture, it looks like a vast wasteland. Where could all these people possibly live during the decades that this is going to take during reconstruction without leaving Gaza? So we set about looking at answers to that question, and we really came up with 5 main options, trying to map out if you want 2 million people to stay in Gaza during reconstruction, where can they live? 70% of housing has been damaged or destroyed. 90% of people have been displaced. So it's a pretty big problem. So we mapped out 5 main options. The first, which has been in the news, is people can leave Gaza. And it turns out about 5% of Gazans have already left. Often people who had dual passports or the ability to leave. So there's some interest in that. But really, if we're looking at how do the rest of the people who want to remain say, where do they live? There are a number of other options. So One of them is going to be camps. The scale of the displacement is so large that there's really no other option except setting up a series of camps. But I think what we've learned historically from camps in recent decades in the Middle East and then in other parts of the world is that camps are really terrible places to live. Once you set them up, they're supposed to be temporary, but they become permanent. And they often, there's a correlation with radicalization in some places. In terms of lifestyles and economic opportunities are very poor and so forth. So given that camps are going to be inevitable, how can camps be set up that avoid some of the risks of the worst pitfalls of camps that we've seen elsewhere? So we worked with some urban planners to design a new idea for camps. And that is assume that they're going to be permanent. Rather than setting up narrow rows of tents, as have been done in other camps in Gaza. So for example, you all may have seen the pictures of the Jabalia camp in Gaza, which had started as rows of tents. And then over time, displaced people living in there had built buildings, and the roads were so narrow that ambulances couldn't even drive. So what had started off as a tent layout turned into a long-term urban slum. So to avoid that, assume a camp is permanent, lay it out like a city, have people move in tents or caravans while construction is going on around them, and then have that camp over time blend into the urban fabric with transportation corridors and so forth. Another option is rehabilitating communities. So if you look at the pictures, it looks like it's all destroyed. When we do satellite analysis, what we find is that there's certainly a lot of destruction, but there are also areas that are not completely destroyed. There are areas that are damaged, but that can be rehabilitated. So we are approaching this from an idea that we're calling incremental urbanism, where people move back into their damaged buildings if they're safe, and then live in communities with some supports over time as reconstruction and repairs go on. At the same time, there are some places are so damaged and destroyed, there's no other option apart from just raising it and then completely rebuilding it. So that will need to happen as well. And then the last option is that if there are open areas that had been agricultural land and entirely new cities could be built. So what we tried to do is take those options and then map them based on the availability of land and found that it's possible. 2 million people can have a decent place to stay with a plan for the long term. So that is what we tried to do with this paper. I think for the Arab state plan that you mentioned, interestingly, they also have plans for what to do with displaced people and how to rebuild. We're hoping that our plan can feed into some of the thinking in the region. We think it's complementary and perhaps supportive. And so what we'd like to be able to do with this plan is to help these various regional efforts and help them more fully develop their thinking on it.
Well, thank you so much. And so, Daniel, thank you also for your work on this. In particular, the report sort of, as Ambassador Reese pointed out, starts out by saying, Hamas cannot stay. So what does that mean in practice? Obviously there's a DDR element, there's there's a huge internal Palestinian political component. And again, the role of Egypt, the role of Arab states in the really since 2007, this effort at reconciliation among the different factions. What are the components of actually making that happen?
Well, thanks, Jonathan. I'll answer that. I'll also answer the question that I wanted you to
Yes,
ask.
okay.
Good. We're always
Please,
doing these forums. So I will also describe what I think is unique about our study. And there's many things that are unique. But for one, I think it offers a pathway towards peace, and it's complete. But I think it's also the minimum viable pathway. All the things in here have to be done in some format, which I think is different than others. It's not just, if these are nice things to happen, these are things that need to happen in some format. And the reason is it does two things. There's requirements that the Israelis have, and that there's requirements that the region and the international community and the Palestinians have, and it meets those. So from the Israeli side, it's designed to meet their security requirements. And part of this is not the annihilation of Hamas, which I think folks that have seen the American wars, annihilation of terrorist groups does not happen. It just doesn't happen. There's no historical example where it works. So I'll come back to that in a second. The other thing it does, our whole pathway is anchored in a Palestinian state. And this is a red line for the Saudis, for basically the whole region. And so it embraces those two concepts: Israeli security and also a state for the Palestinians. So part of the Israeli security is the elimination of Hamas. In the report, because it covers so many different things, it's designed to basically be a guidebook, the things that need to happen. We leave a lot for the diplomats. This is, we're very glad to have Charlie leading us, because he would say, don't micromanage here, don't micromanage there. There needs to be space for negotiation. Things need to happen. The one piece of feedback that we've been getting is that you have this 2-paragraph discussion that says, DDR Hamas, and you talk about how it must be done, and then you talk about how it's difficult. So the feedback we've gotten, either indirectly from the Israelis or directly from other people, has explained how that works. And that's the thing we're going to be doing now. There are successful examples. Some in the book, KLA, Kosovo Liberation Army, I think is a great example. And we're happy to talk at length about that. In that particular case, the KLA, the leadership had a pathway towards political leadership. This is often part of DDR. Sometimes it becomes part of the security force. There's denazification. One of the things we're going to do at this point is talk about those in more detail, talk about how they apply. So we'll have a more fulsome answer. In terms of what the regional partners do, Charlie emphasized the role of the U.S. as a process orchestrator. I think the other thing that's really important is we don't imagine the Gulf as a bill payer. So a lot of people say, Saudi's going to write the check. That's not really part of our proposal. It's more China's paying for economic infrastructure. Europe is paying for a lot of the development and humanitarian assistance. For the Gulf, we want them to have a stake in the game. Again, we're general on what a multilateral security force is, but it will almost certainly have to have Gulf leadership, either Saudi or Emirati of some format, with the Egyptians, maybe with the Jordanians. So what will that joint force look like? Again, we leave it for the diplomat. But again, it's not just the Gulf writing a check here. It's them taking a significant role in the peace, because they have to be the leaders. I'll just close with one thing. Charlie started by talking about the leadership vacuum. The other thing we emphasize throughout the entire report is the importance of leadership. Someone needs to stand up. Someone needs to be the Sadat of this conflict. We're not clear who it is. But that doesn't necessarily have to be from the Palestinian side. It can be from the Palestinian side, it can be from somewhere else. But I'll pause there.
Or Jerry Adams. One final thought is that we made, a year ago, we started working on this. We made a decision. We weren't going to try to get into ceasefires, hostage exchanges, and so forth, because that was the job for the diplomats, and that is really hard to get into as an outside institution, even with people who have been inside. And we knew that, and we hoped that it would have been resolved before we actually finished our work. But Daniel and I did an op-ed in the Hill newspaper just the day after the day before the ceasefire announcement of January 19th was made, which said, it's great that there's a ceasefire. There's been too much violence. It's great hostages are coming home, but it's only the beginning. And we feel, and perhaps I'm maybe a little sensitive to this, but we feel that a lot of the coverage of this issue and a lot of the thought of this issue very much focused, understandably enough, on hostage return, ceasefire, tribulations of one thing or another, restarting the conflict, humanitarian access, but that not enough thought is over the longer term. What's the horizon? How do you get there? And what do we need to be doing now to think about that? And that's where we tried to aim our study.
So Jonathan, sorry, one more I forgot to mention. So the other thing that our study has is it offers a vision for how this ends in a positive way. And this is the work that Shelley's been doing camps to communities, but the other part is doing studies, and I can't remember what it's called, but it's effectively, it's how you build a Palestinian state with an economy that functions. How do you invest in it? How do you actually build this thing? So it says, how do you get there and also where you're going? And this will be very important, I think, from at least from where my analysis of the situation, if the Saudis, which I think are the key player here, if they don't see a vision for where this is going and how you're going to get there, irreversible steps along that pathway, then they'll never come to the table. And I think that's what is different here as well, positive vision.
Wonderful. So maybe I'll just start the question and answer period by asking two questions to the entire panel, maybe, and then give our audience a chance to warm up and get some questions ready. I mean, I guess the first question for me is what, and Daniel, you started to talk about this a little bit, but what has the reaction been? And is there any engagement either, here in Washington or in the region, what has the feedback been, and how do you plan to sort of move forward with that? And I think the second, in some ways, Ambassador, you were very diplomatic at sort of saying that there really hasn't been a plan. But there's been a number of plans, but certainly I think a big issue is that the Israelis don't actually have a plan for moving forward. And in some ways, that's a lot of what is driving the current war. And since the ceasefire broke down, but again, not to just pick on Israel alone, but also the internal divisions within the Palestinian body politic. Of course, who is there? As mentioned in the report, who is there to actually talk to? So how much of this is really just about the internal political issues as driver of the conflict? And so, does that sort of put international actors and the sort of subjects of your proposal at a not just a disadvantage, but really as spectators in some ways? So for you
well,
first, and then
let me start out. I don't want to go into, we've been making doing meetings like this and making an effort to get this study known. Even before publication, we briefed the transition team, we briefed the outgoing U.S. administration, we briefed other major players. We actually, because we published it on the 28th of January, we did the first events in Europe because the new administration had just come in. As we all recall, the first 2 or 3 weeks are very news heavy, and a lot of other things are happening. So we did Chatham House in London, and we did the German Marshall Fund in Brussels. We have been making special efforts, as you might expect, to make sure that all the governments, the Israelis, the Arab governments, the United States, the Europeans, and entities, military thinkers and our colleagues in the think tank community know what our analysis is, and that. Frankly, having been involved in a lot of RAND studies, that's actually the biggest challenge. Not writing it, it's getting people to read it and think about it and take it forward. And so we're really focused on that, and we'll continue to do it for months to come. There are a lot of other things happening, and so there are a lot of distractions and so forth. On the question of I don't really want to comment about or criticize one government or another government. I am, having been involved in government over my career, I am cognizant of the problem that governments face, where operations trump strategy every time. You do the least you can to keep all your options open. And that often works against longer term things. And if there's a role for people like us on the outside, it's to try to point out these kinds of things. Nevertheless, this one has been particularly messy, I would say. it is timely to think about this. And we've been really pleased that we've been able to marshal our resources so we can do these follow-on studies, the one that Shelley did and the DDR study, because we think as we get engaged in dialogue with people, we find where they want more, and that's what we've been able to do.
Okay.
Just one, I guess, two bits of feedback. The one is, part of the reason we're doing the DDR studies, that's been consistent feedback, which is how do you DDR thoughts? Like, it's like, what can be learned from case studies or historical practices? There's a handful of folks that do it. USAIP, of course, used to be one of those places. There's not that many others that really focus on this issue. So we're going to embrace that. Hopefully we can add some value there. I think the other thing, the study focuses on leadership because I think we all recognize that leadership is really important. A lot of folks have said, how do you help build that leader? And how do you help identify that leader? How do you help build that leader? Again, we know from the Camp David Accords how the story ended for Anwar Sadat. It's not one that it's hard to get folks to take that risk. And so, how do you start the process? And this is, I think, the question, keep going. Where's T equals 0 for this?
Well, I'll take your second question,
Sure.
which is on the role of plans. And I think what we've tried to do with the Pathways report is come up with something that's comprehensive and foundational. So at this point, there are a lot of plans about the day after in Gaza, and many of them are focusing in on a single stovepiped issue. What we thought was missing was looking really A to Z, everything from the security to reconstruction to the economics, both short-term and long-term, to try to provide a foundation. So while what diplomats and governments are engaged in the operations, what needs to happen tomorrow, we have the luxury of being able to step back and provide the comprehensive overview there. And I think we've tried to add to that with the two infrastructure projects as well, viewing the housing study as very short term. So where do people live the second there's a ceasefire? But then also long term, if there is peace and investment, what could this look like? What would a great transportation system look like? Or what would adequate water or a clean environment look like? So we tried to be able to take this gap while this horrific fighting is going on and have some plans that are ready to go for when it stops.
Thank you. I'll open it up to the audience now, so just please raise your hand, sir.
Thank you so much for the concerted and coordinated efforts you put to come with such a comprehensive study. I hope I'm not biased as a proud member of RAND and I stand in nuclear security postdoctoral fellow working with Michelle Grace and Carl Mueller and the outstanding members. I'm delighted, Daniel, that you invoke the legacy of Sadat. And I have 3 specific points to share with the panel now in the framework of questions. Ambassador, you all have reiterated the leadership vacuum and the leadership problem. And Sadat and Begin. But I guess the third layer is also the United States. That was the legacy of 1977 in terms here of coercion and reassurance. Where is the U.S. ground strategy in terms of coercing allies and reassuring also other parts of the conflict? And Ambassador, this is my second point. I am intrigued by you challenging the conventional narrative that the U.S. is not the sole, the only mediator in this conflict. And permit me to just raise 3 sub-points here. How could you substantiate this when the U.S. has the only security deployment in the Middle East in terms of procurement and military posture? Secondly, you mentioned that China is invited. How could we envision an invitation for China when its very presence in the Middle East is perceived as a threat, especially in terms of in the framework of the agreed-upon competition? And thirdly, regarding Russia, you characterized it as a spoiler. And I guess the unspoken discourse regarding Russia is the fact that Russia too has very close security coordination with Israel over many files, including but not limited to the Syrian file. My very last point to the three of you. You have eloquently used the term durable peace that is actually used in the official discourse of the Arabs in talking about peace. The point I want to mention here is the issue of sequencing. When approaching Gaza or the Palestinian question, how do you perceive the issue of sequencing? And here I'm talking about 2 points. Palestine first or the Gaza first versus the comprehensive peace, which is Lebanon and the Syrian front, and the sequencing also in terms of the political, the imperative or economic first and then moving to the political. Thank you so much for
A lot of questions.
A lot of questions, very good questions. Thank you very much. I guess I will try to tackle them. And I'm sure you'll come back if I miss something. I think we talk about we do have a whole case study on Camp David and Anwar Sadat, and it makes it clear that Sadat's going to Jerusalem was only the beginning. It took Jimmy Carter to seize the opportunity and to drive things forward and the role that he played. We also have a case study in Northern Ireland. In Northern Ireland is a similar kind of a situation. It was clear that Gerry Adams and the nationalists were prepared to see something other than constant terrorism as the future for their movement in Ireland. And Tony Blair played an important part, but so did George Mitchell and so did Bill Clinton, let's face it. And they helped construct the complicated elements of the Good Friday Accord. Those are two examples in which the United States played a critical mediating role. But let's face it, we've tried that all the way back to Kissinger's day here. And we think that the world has changed and that one of the problems is that too many other major parties with major influence don't feel agency and don't feel involvement. And yes, we tried with the quartet vehicle to bring the Russians and the Europeans onto the stage, but it didn't work. And that we see, and maybe they were wrong, but we see that the United States has to play a major role. If the United States washes its hands of the thing, then you will not get a resolution or a durable peace. But that without the engagement of others, especially Gulf Arabs and the Egyptians who have lived very close to this problem for a very long time and have contributions to make, we're not going to get to where it is that we think that we should. So that was our logic. You asked about challenges. How could there be anybody else when only the United States is deployed? Well, I would say that all the neighbors have forces in the region, and obviously the security environment in the Middle East more broadly has changed in the last year dramatically because of the success against Hezbollah, the changes in the relationship between Iran and the rest of the region, the changes in Syria. These are all dramatic things, and they will not stop. It's not like you can park them and say, we stop, we're not interested in Syria, we're just going to do Gaza, Palestine. We have to do everything, and we have to be engaged in everything. But we feel that with this issue and this conflict, that there needs to be a structure and a plan, and that it can very much easily fit with the transition that is happening in the broader region. The Russians, are they really a spoiler, or do they have a role themselves? I think in this, if you say, well, what would the Russians think about the vision that we have? And let's say it happened. Would they welcome it? I don't think so. I think Putin and his vision of Russia as a player would be that they would find that threatening, particularly an outcome which was based on cooperation between the West and the Arab world in securing a long-term peace that secured the Israeli state forever and gave Palestinians what they had hoped to get. I think that the Russians would find that threatening. But by contrast, I don't think the Chinese would. I think the Chinese, and we envisage their engagement as mainly on the economic side. Someone was saying to me earlier today that if you want to build a bridge in 6 months, you want the Chinese building the bridge because they can do that and they can train and work with Palestinians to undertake reconstruction. It would be very, very difficult, and I saw this when I was in Baghdad, very difficult to successfully import American major construction firms to tackle some of the challenges, even with local partners. But the Chinese have demonstrated their ability to work in difficult environments and to do so quickly. And I think for political reasons, what's important to keep this process on track is to show quick benefits of peace. So I guess that's, did I forget anything?
Well, I had one thing on sequencing, which and I'm not exactly sure how you framed it, but I'll give you one answer. You can tell me if I'm on target. In terms of sequencing, again, we have the 4 major parts of the pathway: security, governance, economics, and social rehabilitation. I can't remember what we call it, social services. Really, in terms of sequencing, the first is creating the multilateral security force. That is where it begins. And basically everything else is predicated on that. So in terms of sequencing, it's the thing that underpins everything. Can you build a security force that is credible to the Palestinians? It can protect Palestinians and can protect Israelis and is acceptable to the Israelis. That is really the challenge. Everything else flows from there. And then we do have it sequenced short, medium, and long for each of those. In terms of the US as a process orchestrator, on the security front, we do see them in a substantial role, but not one where US troops are deployed on the ground. Because US troops deployed in Gaza is not going to be a credible security force in terms of protecting the Palestinians. Saudi's forces are actively deployed in Yemen. There's forces around. The Emiratis, of course, are also deployed. They have active deployments or forces that could be redeployed there. We leave that again for the diplomats to sort out. But the creation of the multilateral security force immediately following ceasefire is the #1 priority. And this is what we emphasize. And if you don't have that planned, the ceasefire will not work.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. My name is Abigail. I'm a student of Professor Lincoln, and it's great to hear you bringing in international actors such as China and the United States. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask about international organizations like the United Nations. We are, I would say, maybe in a different place now than, for example, as Kosovo with, sorry, I keep on saying the name, that's not right. UNFOR, and you know what I'm talking about. Excuse me. And I'm curious if you can sort of discuss if we've moved past the, the time in which the UN had a big impact, and now we're seeing series of influence, and that's why you haven't mentioned it yet before, or if there's another role that you see the UN play.
Well, the UN is obviously the forum for international discussion and debate about all problems, not only of security, but more broadly of economic and social development, and will always remain so. The Israelis, though, are convinced that the UN is systematically anti-Israeli, and they have a lot of evidence that they cite. For us, from the standpoint of effectiveness, the Israelis won't trust the UN force. And if you made it a Chapter 7 mission, you'd also have the problem of a Russian veto that might complicate things. we envisage a multinational security force like what was done in Bosnia. And it would be notified to the UN. Obviously, the major players in the international system do something that's important. It's important to inform everybody of what you're doing, what your objectives are, so that they are reassured that you are aiming at what is consistent with the UN Charter objectives. But to use the UN mechanisms, we just don't think they're credible enough and strong enough to tackle what may be one of the toughest peacekeeping missions ever.
I can add to that as well. In addition to security needs from UN or NGOs and other similar organizations, there will be a huge need for social services once the fighting stops. And at this point, the local Palestinian social services have been devastated. So nearly all schools, hospitals have been severely damaged or destroyed. The systems have broken down. For example, all kids have been out of school since October 7th when that happened. So we're at a year and a half of an entire location with no K-12 schooling. Anybody who would be administering those services has probably been displaced multiple times, traumatized. Those systems are now essentially shattered. And once there is a ceasefire, something will need to be implemented to manage social services. So to build housing, get emergency education, get emergency help going. And given the state of locals there, there's no alternative apart from the international community doing that. And it could be a UN agency, there could be additional investment in NGOs, but that's the role of the humanitarian community to be able to fill those needs of urgent social services. In the long run, that's not particularly healthy. So for example, for the past 50, 70 years, the UN has been providing education for about half of the kids in Gaza. So you essentially had a system that was split between a public school system and UN education. And so there are questions to be raised about, is this a healthy long-term solution to have social services administered by the international community over the long term? I think that's a question to be answered, but in the immediate term, there's really no other alternative, and that will be an important part for planning.
My own, just to say, and we'll go to the next question, but my only, I agree generally speaking, but I think just as a former UN diplomat myself, the issue that you might run into is that to unlock Arab support, for example, for a multinational force, they will likely require as much UN as you can possibly throw at it for their own systems. The same thing goes for European financial support, for example, just as a sort of catch-all for actually giving the money for any sort of rehabilitation, because at least in those systems it still matters. Maybe not so much here, but I don't disagree with the general point. Sorry, here.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Anna. I'm from Colombia and I'm doing the Master's in Conflict Resolution and Peace Building here in Georgia. Before coming here, I worked in the implementation of the peace agreement that we signed in Colombia in 2016, which had a big focus on DDR and their integration, mobilization of the FARC that was our guerrilla. And I was wondering, when you mentioned how DDR is needed in order to ensure Israeli security, because of the situation of the past year and how to prevent that young Palestinians seek to join these armed groups with what has been going on. So maybe I haven't read the report yet, but I'm interested in learning about this DDR focus, which is the first time I've heard it in the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and I'm really interested in learning a little more about it.
Daniel?
Yeah, I'll give a brief answer. I mean, Colombia, of course, is the great success story that
We want to talk to you.
it is. It also in that particular circumstance, they were concentrated outside urban areas. They weren't part of the communities. I mean, the circumstance in Gaza was more difficult than any other, probably. So it's one of the things we were just started this DDR thing just about a week ago. So maybe we can't have a conversation about that. Probably, some examples from Brazil with the favelas and like the criminal networks there. Those are potentially more relevant. Again, we're trying to figure out what are examples that are relevant. traditional DDR, and there's a list of DDR programs. Most of them don't fall into they don't really look like Hamas. They look much more like the FARC. So it's one of the things we're going to be trying to do right now is identify cases that are actually relevant. So we'd be very interested in following up on that.
Yeah, thank you very much for the study. And I came because it talked about a pathway for a durable peace. Could you have started this study in 1948? No, I'm serious.
Well,
And would it have looked similar to this with your 4 things that must happen, but before anything can happen, security and leadership must occur first or primarily? And if so, why hasn't that happened?
well, I mean,
In the region, I think it's a regional issue.
yeah, sure it is. And it's really, really hard, which is why it hasn't worked. And despite very smart people putting a lot of effort and courage into the solution. We would have been better off had a different approach been taken in 1948, 49. I was born in 51, so I have an alibi. But it is yes, I think we need to learn from what has come before. That's the role of history, that's the role of academia, that's the role of all of us. But we can't be paralyzed by the inadequacy of previous approaches. And there are things like Northern Ireland where seemingly intractable disputes were able to be resolved, at least temporarily. And one of the things you don't hear in Britain very much is that critical to resolution of the Good Friday Accords in Northern Ireland was Britain's involvement in the EU. The EU, and of course, Brexit was complicated by the problems of Northern Ireland, because nobody really wanted to return to violence in Northern Ireland for the mere fact of getting out of the EU. So everything is complicated, and we need to be mindful of these things, but we can't be paralyzed.
But my only recommendation is don't include the people who can kill and the people who can be killed in the solution from the beginning. You will have.
We agree completely.
We're just about time if you have a quick
Okay.
question.
Yes, you've looked at from 1948, all the efforts to get the peace, Camp David, and another.
We have a chapter on it.
So, your thoughts about, could anything have been done differently at those events to have made a difference?
Well, it's a good question. We didn't look at it with that angle. Our angle was, what lessons could you draw from it that would be relevant now, rather than to try and re-engineer past times. My old boss, Stu Eisenstadt, has written a book recently about diplomacy, and he was at Camp David with Carter and has a lot of time about Camp David, and it was a very near-run thing. It almost fell apart a lot of times. I mean, much has been written about Camp David, but it's good to read it now because it tells you how dodgy this is to actually get to the construct that we now take for granted as a foundation for the relationship between Egypt and Israel. But it was a very near run thing, and there was a lot of misunderstandings, and there were, as famously in the suitcases on the stuff. But those are issues of diplomatic history, and we're trying to look at the bigger principles involved.
I mean, the one thing I'd add briefly, and Jonathan, I know this is what you work on, but the point, where would you actually start it? I mean, maybe I would start with the Egyptian forces pushed too far. They thought they could take the whole thing when they were liberating the Palestinians. They thought they could push all these. That's probably the point where I would start this. And then so did the Egyptians start this? Again, it would be
Yeah.
counterfactual history here. I mean, it would be,
Fun to write,
there would be
but-
no policy. I mean, what would the state even look like if we started there? Anyways, I mean, it would be,
Sure.
this is what Jonathan does.
Let me just because we're at time here and it's late. So thank you so much, really. A tremendous panel and really for the incredible report. And I just want to say that both in my days as a practitioner and now as an academic, I find your analysis incredibly valuable. I think it's going to be incredibly valuable for our students as well. And just to say that, you know, and I mentioned the ARC report, and I was working in Jerusalem as a UN official when that came out. And I want to just say it was so important, even if it's not, some might argue it's not implementable or it's not realistic, whatever, but it showed something. It showed a vision for a Palestinian state, for a two-state solution that you could put on paper that could work potentially. And I think that that's really invaluable. We're not at that situation yet, but I think that you've really lived up to the reputation of RAND with this report, and it's incredibly valuable. So thank you very much
Thank you.
for all of it.